A very, very good evening to all of you who have logged in today. At AIACA, we have initiated a learning platform called Shilp Samvaad for craftspersons, practitioners, researchers, enterprises, organizations in these challenging times for the sector. The webinar today is the first amongst many of our thematic offerings that will seek to examine and explore the various perspectives and approaches in theory and practice prevalent in and relevant to the sector. More importantly, we will take a deeper dive with a close ear to the ground at those frameworks that can play a critical role in the rejuvenation of lives and livelihoods of artisans and craft workers in these challenging times of COVID. Keeping this context in mind, I am delighted to introduce today's special curation, Unpacking Sustainability Within the Crafts System. What is the nature of this particular beast that is sustainability? What are the relevant frameworks that can be applied to the craft sector within the concepts of natural capital, the circular economy, the 100-mile community, for example? What are the particular challenges of application of sustainable principles across craft practices, given the sheer diversity, differences in scale, and the unorganized or particularly organized nature of craft practice? AIACA has been working on issues of sustainability in the craft sector over the past many years. For over a decade now, the Craftmark certification has assured consumers and buyers that Craftmark certified products are made in India, that they are born out of authentically handmade processes, they are of high quality, and that they are produced using fair labor and under decent working conditions for artisans who are being paid a fair wage. The Craftmark certification thus has enabled economic and social sustainability of craft businesses for its members and is now adding a third handle on environmental sustainability related to energy use, water use, use of hazardous chemicals, waste management, raw materials, packaging, etc. The Craftmark Green program will establish a robust certification system through research and direct interventions called Craftmark Green, which will cater to producers, buyers, consumers, and the crafts industry as a whole in the long run. Our distinguished speakers today will bear upon the relevance of these efforts among many, many others in the sector with their own insights into the sustainability landscape as it exists today. I would also encourage all of you who have tuned in to park your questions in the question and answer box in the bottom of your screen, and providing time is available, we will direct these questions to our speakers at the end of the session. I am delighted to welcome our first speaker, Professor Ashok Chatterjee. He has a background in the engineering industry, international civil service, the Tourism Development Corporation, and has spent 25 years in the service of the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad, where he was executive director, senior faculty, distinguished fellow and professor of communications and management. He has served a range of development institutions in India and overseas, particularly in the sectors of drinking water, sanitation, disability, livelihoods, education, as well as his work with artisans in many parts of the country. He was the Honorable President of the Crafts Council of India for over 20 years and continues to serve the Council as its advisor. Aside from all of these illustrious credentials, Professor Chatterjee is simply known to many of us working in the craft sector as an unalloyed champion for rural artisans and craft workers, and a mentor and enthusiast for new initiatives and innovations in the sector. Professor Chatterjee, welcome to Shilp Samvaad, and over to you.
Thank you, Shreya. I hope you can hear me because this Zoom has a habit of just disappearing.
We can hear you fine, Professor Chatterjee.
Thank you, thank you. I think your initiative is a very good one. It's very welcome, particularly at a time when we have lost one of the great champions of our sector. One of the things that had troubled her greatly was the declining support and understanding of the importance of crafts in the contemporary context. And that contemporary context included the enormous environmental challenges which are facing the globe, uh, right across the globe. My understanding is that your interest this evening is to focus particularly on that particular challenge which we often call greening of crafts. And if I'm right about that focus for the discussion today, then I think that one of the things that we should be both encouraged by and also concerned by is that in the struggle to get recognition for the importance of artisans and their wisdom and their crafts in this country, we need to be able to communicate clearly the enormous contribution as well as to the empowerment of those who are at the margins of all of our societies, which unfortunately is where most of our artisans still reside. But in the context of greening, we have to make this movement understood as a major force against the threat of climate change and for the intelligent use of the limited resources which we have, which nature has given us. Another thing that has become critically important, which is linked to this, has been underlined by the COVID pandemic, where we have now begun to, hopefully, begun to understand that the future of livelihoods in India has to be in rural areas, to people where they live, and to save them from the horrors of migration and for the kind of suffering that millions have gone through in recent months in their efforts to walk back home, and many of them dying and starving on the roads. Now, the answer to that is linked to your emphasis on green production, which is that the craft industry, like no other, offers alternatives of non-farm livelihoods to rural communities, helping them to remain where they are and to produce and to live and to thrive in their own locations. So that becomes a really important message which we have to give forward. Having said that, it's not easy to just say that crafts are green, because even if you are a village artisan, access to raw materials is a big challenge these days. Our forests are disappearing. There are rules and regulations that prevent artisans from accessing forest produce. All kinds of difficulties are there. So we have to look at the supply chain and build that supply chain intelligently at different craft locations with local artisans taking the lead, because they have the wisdom and the knowledge of their local resources. And backing that up with the inputs of education about finance and technology, which greening requires. However, this is not just an urban problem. I know that you are familiar with the problems that many of our urban artisans are facing. And over the last decades, so much of craft production has moved into urban slums. They also need attention in this effort towards greening. You know the problems that potters, for example, are having in urban communities across this country, where new environmental regulations are pushing them out of their locations, removing them from their sources of raw material and of energy, which they need for making pots and for their craft. So there's this whole complexion of issues, and there's no one silver bullet. The real challenge for us is to build the partnerships that can, the interdisciplinary partnerships that can now come together in a clear agenda for green crafts. and how these green crafts can then be communicated to the marketplace. The demand for green production will have to come from consumers, both in India and overseas. Already, the overseas demand for green production is huge, and we should emphasize that in this situation of pandemic, when people think that crafts are not critical to revival, to tell them how critical they can be, because there's this huge demand for what India can do, which no other country can respond to at the scale that we can. But in order to exploit that advantage, we need to put systems in place. There is the other issue that is linked to climate change, which is the issue of buying less, of consuming responsibly. And here again, there can be a role for craft organizations like AIACA and for all of us to communicate to the markets of the world that when you buy a craft product, you are buying a connection with another human being. And hopefully that COVID has made us value these connections. We have to be able to communicate those connections. We have to indicate that supporting crafts is supporting a human value. That value which we have possibly taken for granted until COVID hit us. Now that should be another platform for promoting Indian craft and for crafts all over the world. So greening has to be seen in a variety of ways, not just the environmental indicators, but equally the social, human, political, and indeed in this context, even the spiritual indicators. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chatterjee. I don't think that I could have set a better tone for the discussions to ensue today. We are talking about sustainability, which has become a bit of a buzzword in this sector, and unpacking sustainability and understanding the value and the benefits of sustainability right down the chain to the last artisan craftsperson standing becomes an important aspect of this conversation, and hopefully one that our speakers will highlight moving ahead. Thank you, Professor Chatterjee. We move on to the next speaker who we have with us here today. My pleasure to introduce Mr. Ashish Kothari. He is one of the founder members of the organization Kalpavriksh, which is an Indian development organization that works on environment issues. He has served on the board of directors of Greenpeace International and Greenpeace India. He has also been on the steering group of the Convention on Biodiversity Alliance and the ICCA Consortium. Interestingly, I read today that ICCA was not an acronym. It is an abbreviation to mean territories and areas conserved by indigenous peoples and local communities, or territories of life. Extremely evocative and interesting concept. Mr. Kothari has served on the Indian government's Environmental Appraisal Committee on River Valley projects and expert committees to formulate India's Biological Diversity Act and National Wildlife Action Plan. He coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan process and was co-coordinator of the activist academic co-generation of knowledge on environmental justice global project. He also has been active with a number of people's movements and helps to coordinate currently the Vikalp Sangam, the Alternatives Confluence process in India, and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives globally. As I was saying before beginning the sessions today, Mr. Kothari weaves together his many interests in conservation, environment, indigenous communities, and social justice effortlessly in his work. And it is this intersectionality that he brings to his recent explorations in the craft sector, and inviting him to begin his comments today.
Thank you, Shreya. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. I'm a bit of a sticking out like a sore thumb here because I noticed from the entire panel, I'm the only one who's actually not an expert or experienced with crafts, other than this recent study that some of us were engaged with. And so my credentials on craft are very short-lived and somewhat superficial. So please excuse me if I make any glaring mistakes on that front. I completely agree with what Ashokji has said. So I'm going to try and build on it and not repeat. But just to say that whatever I make, the presentation I make and the points I make are within the context of acknowledging that crafts, especially whatever is handmade, are in fact the most sustainable way of production. And certainly compared to industrialized, mechanized mass production, that is the way we should have gone all these decades after independence. Unfortunately, we haven't, but we still need to fight for that. Secondly, I also want to acknowledge here some of what I'm going to talk about is a study that was jointly done between Kalpavriksh and Khamir, and Meera was involved with that. And I notice in the attendees, I think Ghatid Bhai is there and possibly some of the others who were part of the study. So maybe in the discussion, they can also add points that I miss out on. So I will share some slides. Just let me know if this works. Can you see them full screen? Shreya, can you see this?
Yes, Mr. Kothari.
Okay, thanks. Right, so this is based, what I'm going to talk about is based on a 2-year study that, as I said, Kalpavriksh, Khamir and the weavers, the Wankars of Kutch carried out in 2017, 18, 19. And from that, some of the sort of general lessons that we learned on the basis of that. What we tried to do was to look at the kind of transformations that were taking place in their livelihoods and their lives because of the revival of Varnat, of handloom weaving, based especially on innovations that they and Khamir carried out with respect to the organic Kala cotton, which is indigenous to Kutch. And because that the products made out of them gained quite a good market, there has been a very significant revival of handloom weaving in Kutch, unlike most other parts of India. So we tried to look at multiple dimensions of what this transformation did. Just to backtrack a little bit, I think we have seen with the COVID pandemic, and in any case, generally with issues like climate crisis that Ashokji also mentioned, that there is something terribly, terribly wrong with the way we have treated the earth, and especially with our models of what we think of as development. Because essentially development has meant extremely high levels of material and energy throughput, consumption, use, and because of which, of course, huge areas of natural ecosystems and natural resources have been significantly overexploited, destroyed, as you can see in this image here. But also how this process of so-called development has actually alienated each one of us, partly from the rest of nature, but also partly from each other, and also from our own creativity and productivity. And this is something that's especially important for the production sector or the manufacturing sector and with crafts. And so I call that actually a process of moving from livelihood, so crafts, for instance, or agriculture or pastoralism, etc., were livelihoods in which it wasn't just a job, it was an occupation that was contained within cultural, social, political, economic aspects, to what we have now, which are soul deadening jobs, or where immense numbers of livelihoods are being killed off, including in the craft sector. So it's moving towards deadlihoods. So the question that arises for us is this the only way we can go? Is it inevitable that all countries in the world have to go like this? As we were told by Mrs. Margaret Thatcher many decades back, that there is no alternative? Or do we actually have alternative pathways to well-being? And so one of the things we've been doing as Kalpavriksh and Vikalp Sangam is to help document and make known thousands of examples of alternative initiatives in various different fields, basic needs, governance, gender, sexuality, different kinds of injustices, deprivations, and so on, and how people are trying to overcome these and create solutions for themselves in ways that are ecologically sustainable and also in ways that benefit everybody and not just a small section of people. And in particular, totally agreeing with what Ashok ji also said, that if we're looking at what we can do as pathways out of the COVID crisis, which is actually more an economic livelihood crisis than a health crisis, as we've seen it in the last few months, we have to absolutely focus on our primary sectors, that's agriculture, pastoralism, and so on, and on crafts. Now, as we know, we don't know exactly how many people are involved in crafts, so it could be anything between 50 to 200 million people. Ashok ji can correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly it has the potential of involving hundreds of millions of people if, for instance, we look at transforming most of manufacturing and industry into different forms of crafts. So what I have been saying is that we need not just a green recovery, but a rainbow recovery, which is a recovery that actually combines ecological, social justice, equality, gender, and various other such aspects, including one's own personal and spiritual life. So in the study, or in general, one of the things that we've been focusing on, looking at all these different alternative initiatives in the country and other parts of the world, is that we have to start looking at transformations in multiple spheres of life. We have to look at how, for instance, in the economic sphere of life, there's much more democracy, much more control over production by producers themselves, much more control over consumption by us as consumers. We don't even know what we consume and what the impacts of that are these days. But also the economics and economic relations, much more of caring and sharing rather than simply of exploiting each other. Similarly, we need transformations in politics, in who takes decisions. So who is taking decisions with regard to the craft sector or with regard to manufacturing in general? Who is taking decisions with regard to what happens to our forests and ecosystems and so on? And unfortunately, what we've done with politics is we've sort of given up our inherent power as citizens to politicians and bureaucrats, whereas in fact we should be claiming power where we are, much more direct democracy or radical democracy as we call it. We also need transformations in social justice because we have a deeply unequal society, both traditionally and in modern senses. And so issues of gender, casteism, etc. have to be dealt with. And this is something that's very, very relevant for the craft sector, of course. And then, of course, aspects of culture and knowledge, recognizing multiple forms of knowledge systems, recognizing that knowledge should be in the commons and not privatized, which is what's happening, unfortunately. And then the fifth sector of ecology, which is, of course, at the base of all of this, because without protecting the earth, we're all dead anyway, however rich and powerful we might be. So what we did was we applied this, this kind of framework to looking at crafts in Kutch. Now, I'm not going to go into this whole everything that you see on this slide here. I just want to focus on 3 or 4 aspects which are in red and slightly larger font, because that's what relates to today's webinar. So we looked at the relationship between the economic revival and transformation and the ecological and socio-cultural aspects. Just as an aside to say that there's very fascinating kind of transformations taking place in gender relations and in the relations between young people and older people, and the flowering of creativity in especially the youth there. But I'm not going to get into those issues. I'd like to focus on 3 things. One, if you look at the kind of revival that's taken place, it is based on sale of products to the rich in cities like Delhi and Bombay and as far away as Europe. Now, in a way, of course, this is where the markets are, so there's a necessity of doing this, but it does create fragility, and you can see that right now, where this long distance trade has been severely impacted because of COVID and lockdowns. You see that there's an immediate impact, and if this continues for a long time, it could have a very serious impact on the livelihoods of craftspeople who have revived their livelihoods based on this kind of an external market. So that's a major issue of sustainability that needs to be looked at. The same issue also means that, for instance, the ecological handprint of crafts increases, because instead of having local trade, which is what used to be the case, there's now trade happening across the world. And we looked at a little bit of the ecological footprint of this, and that's an issue of concern. On the other hand, the fact that the revival is based on organic Kala cotton, and at least up to the production stage, it's a very localized form of economic transactions and ecological processes. It is very low impact ecologically. There is an increasing move to bring back natural dyes, which will also significantly reduce the ecological footprint. However, for at least 15, 20 years or maybe more, the introduction of chemical dyes, including in the handloom weaving in Kutch, did mean that there was a high ecological footprint. So these are just some aspects of the study that we did, and why I'm bringing these out is to be able to say that even within the craft sector, it's a very complex scenario. It's not as simple as saying that crafts are more sustainable. It also depends on how one does it. We did a ecological footprint analysis of the Kala cotton, the organic Kala cotton versus the BT cotton, which is unfortunately what I think 90-95% of cotton in Gujarat or much of India is growing genetically modified BT cotton. And it's very clear that the ecological impacts of BT is much, much higher than of Kala. And these sorts of studies, I think, need to be done much more. They need to be done not just between the different raw materials that are used, the different yarns that are used, but also the different industrial processes, which we were not able to do. But this is very crucial to be able to show how, in fact, certain forms of crafts are much more sustainable. So what are the key lessons? Instead of just made in India, I think we absolutely have to emphasize the handmade in India. And that's something that's already available. It's not something you need to get foreign companies to come in, or even the Indian companies to come into. It's actually spread across India and has to be sustained and revived. But in doing that, we need to look at it more holistically, to look at what would this mean for the cultural lives, the social lives, the political and economic aspects of the lives of craftspersons and those around them, the settlements they're in, etc. It also means that you can't have a single indicator of sustainability. You know, like GDP has been for development, and it's a absolutely nonsensical indicator. We can't suddenly now have a single indicator, let's say, for how sustainable something is. It's a complex of indicators, and especially emphasizing also qualitative, the quality of life. One of the things that we found very interesting in Kutch was young people, when they were asked, why did you come back to, or why are you sustaining in crafts? You could have gone into IT or something else. And they said that livelihoods are good, but also we can work at home. We are in control of our time. We have no boss. You know, when somebody like you comes along, we can sit and chat for 2 hours and then catch up later. And we're very proud of continuing our heritage, and we can be creative on this. So these qualitative aspects you can't put into quantitative indicators, but they're extremely important parts of craft sustainability. Fourth crucial point, any kind of craft sustainability assessments we do, or indicators we make, or marks, etc., have to have the craftspersons at the center. It cannot be only external people coming and assessing whether something is sustainable, not sustainable, etc. They have to be really at the core of, right from the beginning of even trying to determine what should be the kinds of indicators and marks and so on that we use. So external inputs, like people like us, could be to actually help generate dialogue, to build in external inputs, to bring in things that maybe the local communities are not aware of, but certainly not come in as a dominating kind of thing. Why I'm saying this is very important is because we have 2 forms of certification in agriculture in India, actually 3 forms. One of them is what is dominated or controlled by corporations and government, including one form of the participatory guarantee scheme. And that means that the farmers are always subject to somebody from outside coming and saying, yes, you're organic or not organic, and of course, charging the earth for it, or keeping control. The other is the participatory guarantee scheme, which is run by farmers themselves, but run in a way that the peer reviews are done very extensively and thoroughly. And it's acceptable also as a form of certifying. So to me, something like the PGS, which is run by craftspersons themselves, is what we need to work towards. Thanks. I'm sorry if I've gone a little bit over time. I'll put the full report of the study in the chat box, the link to it, so you can take a look at it later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kothari. And no, you are absolutely absolutely well within time. But more importantly, I think you've ended on a very, very critical note for all of us who are working on issues of sustainability in the sector. When you say that the craft constituencies, the communities themselves need to have a much, much larger stake in these sometimes very abstract discussions that practitioners, researchers, organizations have on sustainability and how it can be translated effectively into the sector. Our recent experiences in introducing and creating awareness or unpacking and demystifying the concept of sustainability in artisan clusters in Rajasthan and Odisha have clearly led us to show that it is not a simple, linear process that one can come in and introduce from outside, however comprehensive the research or the intent or the understanding is. If communities do not have an understanding of what is the nature of sustainability, what will work for them in their own context, and an acceptance of integration of different innovations, technologies, processes in existing work, and also an understanding of how these will add value, then all of this becomes a completely pointless exercise. Many of these innovations, these new technological solutions, etc., lie abandoned in communities and they are not claimed by them as such. I think this is an extremely important part of the sustainability discourse that we need to keep in mind moving ahead. So thank you for your inputs, Mr. Kothari.
Thank you. If I can
want to move ahead.
Shreya, sorry, just to quickly mention, one of the key people in the ecological footprint analysis was Arun Dikshit. He's also on the call, so maybe later if he wants to add something. I see him in the attendees. Thank you.
Sure. That would be lovely. Let me move on now to our third speaker. Meera has been in the sector for a very long time, for over 3 decades now. And while conversing about this webinar, we were joking with each other as to the number of hats that she has worn in the sector and what I should introduce her with. But suffice to say that she's been a co-founder of Kutch Mahila Sangathan and was the director of Khameer from 2019 to 16. And during which the Kala Cotton initiative also that Ashish was speaking about was developed. Currently, she is part of the Creative Dignity Network in a leading role, and we know the impact that has been created by this movement, which has been generated out of a response to the effects of COVID-19 on rural artisans and enterprises across India. Meera also has been involved in the capacity of a researcher with us in the initial phases of the Green Project. And she is the author of the report that she is presenting the findings of, a report that we will be subsequently placing in the public domain for all of your comments and inputs as well. So welcome, Meera, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Shreya, for that introduction. I think among the many hats that I wear, I definitely am not a researcher. So this report that we did for AIACA was actually not just my work. It was the work of many people who were part of the team. And I'll sort of unpack it as we do the presentation. My interest really was to, I got involved in this project with AIACA because my interest was really to check this, this hypothesis or this instinctive knowing that we all have that the crafts are a green sector. And I thought that doing this study was really for me to assess this, to examine this, to find which is the direction one can really take to seriously moving towards giving some kind of proof of this, because we are often accused of being very nostalgic and romantic about these things. So can one actually find a way to, in a very concrete way, to take this to the public domain? So can I request Karuna to put up my presentation, and then I can start sharing a little bit of what we found. Karuna, can you please share my presentation?
Yes, I think he's on it right now.
Okay, let me just quickly tell everyone that, one of the people who, I don't know if she's attending this webinar today, but who I'd really like to call out, that she was really the researcher on this study. And her name is Pooja Lakhwal. She did a lot of the secondary research and also helped a lot with the writing of this report. So, and of course, I want to thank Anjali, Avnish, Madhura, and later on Shreya and Shrishti also joined in the this completion of this report. So it was great interacting with all you guys. And here are the results now, which I'm going to sort of briefly share. Okay, while the presentation is coming on, I can continue. So this study was done in 2000. It was undertaken in 2018, and it was a very ambitious project, which we realized later. We wanted to complete it in 1 year, and we thought we would do like an overview of crafts across textiles, leather, metal, other hard material crafts like natural fibers. We ended up studying a lot of textile crafts because that's also one of the more dominant practices in our sector today. Also, the sort of the knowledge required to study hard material crafts in more in depth was something we thought we could access experts during the study, and that was like a fine balance because we were always strapped for time. I can't see my presentation. Is it up?
Meera, I'm coordinating with Karuna. He seems
Okay,
to
okay.
share it, but
I thought you all could see it, but I couldn't.
no,
So
no,
that's
no.
why I asked.
There's been some glitch, but he started the screen sharing. It should be on in a bit.
Okay. Okay. So I'll just continue talking in the meantime. So we gave ourselves a year, and we thought that we would sort of do an overview of the different practices across different regions also, just to get a sense of what's happening where. Finally, there we are. Yeah, so yeah, I've explained this, and for me personally, I think I was really very interested in actually trying to see if, yeah, you can go to the next slide, Karuna. I was really interested for me to understand that what was the understanding that artisans had regarding this concept of sustainability that we talk about so easily, and was there traditional wisdom about this sort of balanced living with ecology and human well-being. And my interest was really to try and get into those kind of discussions with artisans through the medium of this study, and to use that understanding to actually create the groundwork for a green labeling that AIACA could then work on. But we realized that because we had given ourselves such a big scope, change the slide please, such a big scope, it wasn't possible to get into those kind of detailed discussions with artisans. One actually has to spend a lot more time in one place in a very sort of intimate way to actually get to that. So unfortunately, that was something that we were not able to do, but we did get a good sense of what was happening in the field. We also had many interviews with experts. We tried to sort of cross different sectors like architecture, agriculture. We tried kind of tried to get a sense of how they were going about looking at their own sustainability. But again, I must say that it has been more of an overview, and but definitely there are some learnings for us to build on. We also realized as we were going through the study, and much more now that I'm working with so many more artisans across India, I realized that actually many craft clusters are totally linked to local economies. And just to pick up on Ashish's point, that in a crisis like COVID, it's a question to ask that would a local economy be more resilient than an economy that is dependent on external forces? But I think COVID has been an all-round disaster. So, so far the sense I'm getting is that even the local economy has crashed. So that's a question that we do need to understand, that what makes local economies, apart from the whole ecological question, how would they behave in a crisis? So, I mean, that's just a question we need to examine. But I do believe that we didn't really study, while we talk of local economies, we didn't really study the very local economies for this report. And this definitely is something we need to look at moving forward. Next. So, a lot of the secondary research we did, and I think everyone's been talking about it, there's just too much. I mean, sustainability is a serious business now, and I mean that at every level. And it's just too many things, too many approaches to one basic truth. And that is that you just need to have balance, where you're balancing your environment, your economy, and societal well-being. I think it all actually just comes down to that. And in that, production and consumption play a really, really important role. And that's where we need to look at crafts. Next. So we actually decided that in all these sort of many concepts and understanding about sustainability, what was it that was relevant to us? If we were looking at production and consumption, we really needed to just understand the whole concept of green economy, which was really at the heart of the Paris Protocol negotiations, and which is now increasingly being promoted even by the United Nations Environment Program. And essentially, here the definition is here for you all to see. It means a low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive, economy. So does that ring any bells? I mean, can you think of somebody or something that would fit this very well? I think we all have a sense of what can fit this kind of definition. But for us to be accepted, we have to be formally included in the clean development mechanism, which is then leading to the recognition of the carbon credit market. So that's the logical route for us to go, that if we want to be accepted as part of the green economy, then can we actually position crafts as a very serious green economy? For that, you need to be in the clean development mechanism. This is what we understood. Next, please. So we decided that let's try and develop our own guiding principles. I mean, there is the, the whole sort of sustainable, the criteria. I mean, all of us know the sustainable certifications and the marks, and there are like a number of criteria that people ask you to fill up. But we said, instead of just taking it in such a fragmented way, why don't we build a holistic vision with which the lens or perspective of this holistic vision with which we can map the practices we are going to visit. And one of the things that seemed to sort of resonate with everybody, even the experts that we spoke of, was decentralization. After all the confusion with all the the sustainability speak and the blah 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 around it, we decided, let's stick to just one man who's close to all of us, and that's Gandhi. Because for him, he kept morality at the heart of it all. And from morality, it led to everything else, to the humanization of a local economy. So we took decentralization and local economies as one of our very strong guiding principles with which to look at these practices. And then we looked at scale, because the two are connected, decentralization and scale. But in today's context, scale has a direct implication on how we are managing resources. And how are we looking at design? What is the role design plays in managing scale? And then we decided to borrow one concept from the whole sustainable sort of debate, and that was the cradle to cradle concept. But it also resonated with us with what Ela Ben is saying in a 100-mile book, 100-mile village, this wonderful book that she has written, where she described the whole product life cycle of a handmade product, which is actually from birth to finish. And so we decided to keep this as one of the guiding principles. And then the last, which both Ashish and AC have, of course, reiterated very strongly, is the socio-cultural capital, which is, as we all know, the understanding of coexistence, not just with human beings, with each other, but coexistence with nature. And we felt that these would be the guiding principles that would be the most important in the way we assessed all the practices we were going to visit. So next. I'll give you a little bit of a like a glimpse of what we found and some of the sort of the grays and the nuances that we came up against. So when we spoke of local economies, I'll give you examples of two. One which was a local economy by like tradition, the Kutch Metal Belts cluster, and one which was a local economy by design, which is Avni. The Kutch Metal Belts cluster is like, I mean, you can see it on the screen. There are about 130 artisans, and their raw material is largely scrap. I mean, everything that they use, even for processing, is largely scrap. They use even biomass from fallen twigs. So it's not even that they have to sort of, cut anything for the fuel. And all the production, all these 130 artisans, even the sourcing of their raw materials is everything within a small, I mean, if you're looking at the 100-mile sort of cutoff, then yes, they fit into that. Electricity in all craft practices, most of them, which are traditional, we know is all domestic. I mean, none of it ever reaches an industrial scale. And most importantly, it has a high social capital, because being a cluster, the skills are perfectly balanced. Somebody is very high skilled, somebody is not so high skilled. So somebody does a finishing job, somebody does a processing job, somebody does a fine tuning job. I mean, it is a perfectly balanced local economy. But even they today, earlier where they sold a lot to the local pastoralists, even today they have become dependent on an export market for their, 50% of what they make is today exported. And they are today now facing a very strong existential crisis. Avni, on the other hand, again, a very self-sufficient design community, completely based on all natural principles of water management. They recharge all the water that they need throughout the year. They only make and produce, natural dyes. They work with solar energy, but they are not sufficient yet in solar energy. They do have to take from the grid. They are trying to address that, and hopefully they will. But again, high social capital, because they've managed to create a community of interaction, engagement, not only among the local communities, but also people who visit them to learn from them and so on. But even there, 80% sales are outside of Uttarakhand. So that comes to the sort of moot point, that in today's scenario, as Ashish has also mentioned, AC has also mentioned, the land use has changed. There's no more control on natural resources. And even the natural resources you may have control on may not have the quality that it had earlier due to so many other factors of degradation. So you have no choice in a global economy but to sort of source raw materials from a longer distance away, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get orders. So the two critical links for a local economy, which is raw material and distribution, today both have been sort of, they have changed. So this is, this is a serious question, that how does one define a local economy then? Do you then create a percentage that, X amount of percentage is done within a certain radius? Do you sort of, create some kind of, okay, national, but not international? I mean, these are all things that have to be studied in depth before one can come to any definition of what a local economy is. Next. And then we come to the question of scale, which is also linked to the local economy. And here I'd just like to say, from whatever I have understood, even speaking with artisans in Kutch and elsewhere and what I've read, I don't think that there was ever a time, unless it was like many, many thousands and thousands of years ago, that things were just produced and consumed locally. I think there was trade. I mean, the Harappan civilization has more than enough evidence that it was a very global civilization. It was exporting to Oman, in very large, it was urbanized, because it had to equip itself to deal with that level of production. I think what has changed is the control on raw material. Earlier, the what was exported and what was manufactured was still sourced locally. So you still had production and consumption of a very high volume happening locally and a certain volume that was going out. But today, very rapidly, in the last 300 years, there's been tremendous scale. I mean, just the figures are here for you to see, just for you to get a sense of what we are up against. So we have to kind of really understand that this scale is here to stay. And if we think that the crafts can actually provide an answer to matching this kind of scale, it's a different level of organization we're going to have to talk of. Next. So I'll take two examples on scale, just to sort of give a sense of how to come to what is the right scale of craft is also an exercise and an organization that will require work. So Purely Designs, which is, you know, a beautiful, charming design company in Almora, with Vasanti and Abhinav, two Indian designers. They operate largely from home, and they have factored their entire design, you could call it eco-design, into the way they make their products. So they completely keep reusing their natural dyed water to the extent that they can, which means that they have a lot of variation in the color, but that variation has got factored into their design. So they may have 3 panels, which may all be of different variations of the same shade. So they let the material dictate their design. They let their commitment to the environment dictate their design. But as a result of what they do, because even the tailoring machines that they use, they are hand operated. They have taken a decision not to use energy for that. But as a result of that, their products end up being very expensive, because almost 70% of their product breakup goes to, it's like a hand wage. And therefore, you know, it's an expensive product. So they are limited by a niche market, and they are grappling today with what's the right balance, what's the turnover they need to keep so that they can remain profitable, and on the other hand, maintain the scale that adheres to their you know, principles and philosophy. On the other hand, you had the Pochampalli Craft Park, which was designed for scale, you know, and we visited that as well. It was completely designed to address export. It has heavy infrastructure, completely the energy that is in, of course, in an industrial bracket. The water that they use, they have 7 to 8 bore wells on their campus. And, you know, as a concept, it was wonderful, because it was giving a very dignified place for a lot of women artisans in a very traditional society to come and work there in a safe environment. It was giving a dignity to craft practice. So wonderful concept. But it was designed for 2,000 artisans at this humongous cost of 50 crores, while it was able to cater, I mean, the active usage was just 350 artisans. So again, it's how do you balance and come to the right scale for these practices. Next. And then we come to the most crucial bit, which is the, you know, the cradle to cradle, which covers production to consumption. And, you know, we fixed on a few criteria, but I'll just talk a little bit about the 3 most critical ones, according to me, which is energy, water, and chemical management. And here too, we found that, you know, everything is pretty customized. For example, and it's really very difficult to say that, okay, if we do an organic standard, then, you know, we have like a gold standard, you know. I mean, we were speaking to Mr. Ramu of the Center for Sustainable Agriculture, and he told us that he doesn't believe that these standards work, because you have to constantly play a balancing act. I mean, sometimes your soil may not have a certain kind of nutrient, and you have to give it that, you know, nutrient artificially if required. But the key is in how much do you use, and how do you use it, and what is the combination of things you're using. I mean, all the Ajarpur block printers, they use synthetic indigo along with other natural dyes. I think very few of them are using natural indigo, but yet we are selling it as you know, a natural dye production. Bodhi is using all kinds of synthetic dyes, but their track record of water consumption and of water treatment and effluent treatment is much higher than even industry. So how are we going to actually create a standard in which we judge? Because solutions, the current solutions that exist for scale, they exist for centralized production. What about these local innovators? How are we going to leverage that? How are we going to give that weightage? Because each unit, and we found that in the study we did with Durga and Ghatit in Kutch for the, the practices of the printers and the dyers, that each unit had its own mix and its own recipe. And not all naphthol dye units, naphthol dyes are carcinogenic. So it's going to be very difficult to just come out with a gold standard. Yeah, Javaja artisans, I mean, shouldn't you rate this? That they work with just the skins of dead animals, and that they feed the tannery waste to stray animals. Shouldn't this get some kind of rating? So these are all questions that came up to us, and I mean, these have been laid out in the study. And so I'm just putting it out here for all of us to think about together. Next. And the one unifying factor which was there across all the units was the socio-cultural capital that was there in each community, which even Ashish and AC have spoken about. And that's the sense of the well-being of connectedness, and just the ability to live in coexistence with another. And because of the nature of the practice, because it's hand, you can't do everything yourself. You have to spread yourself out. You have to work with another. And that is the key to coexistence. So this brings us back to Gandhi again. You have to get human beings to the center of it all. Next. So when I really began looking at all these questions, and they were there was really a need that there should be a green mark. For me, a craft mark was very important because it was talking to the consumers. It was a forward-looking mark. A green mark is an inward-looking mark because you're looking at your own practices. Because a lot of the practices that were traditionally green were green because there was no choice. Today, we have a choice whether we want to be green or whether we want to not be green. And how will you balance the economic vulnerability with the vulnerability of the planet? I mean, these are very real questions. How will you ask an artisan or a producer who has to get food on his plate to convert his practices to products which may cost more to him? So, so you have to, so these were some of the questions that actually were playing in my mind. And I felt that the only way that one could do it, we had a choice either of incentivizing both the producer and the consumer, and going two ways, building the perception in the market. So creating a market-led demand or a government-led regulation. I mean, these are the only two things which are going to change behavior, and which would then, sort of push a producer to change their practice. I'm sure that Pradeep and Mala will also talk about how actually being ecological made a lot of economic sense. So somewhere, how do you do this two connection, that good ecology and good economics can actually go together? And that's really the challenge, in my opinion. Next. So if we really want to get into, we want to be recognized formally as a green economy, then we have no choice but to do these rather expensive life cycle assessments, which are very expert-led, which cost a huge amount, but which will then ensure that we are recognized and part of the clean development mechanism, and we can pitch for carbon credits for our artisans. Can we afford it? Would the government even be interested to do it? Is a question that we need to ask. And who would do this? How would we do it? And for how many crafts will we do it? I mean, Ashish spoke about Kala cotton, but he did a study of 5 artisans in Kutch. But there are like now 250 artisans working with Kala cotton, all sourcing their yarn from different areas. Are we going to be able to study the life cycle of each of them? I mean, these are all very real questions. So to my mind, the way to go would be to work towards a more flexible labeling that grades certain critical criteria, like what's mentioned here, energy, water, low wastage, and give a very high rating to something like socio-cultural capital. Because if collaboration is the key to our survival, then we have to do it differently now. Okay, I've been alerted for time up. And thank you.
Apologies, Meera. You've had the unenvious task of presenting this study, and we anticipated that we'd run out of time even before the session started. But I think this was a very comprehensive snapshot of both the limitations of this kind of study that essentially looked at examining best practices that exist currently in the craft sector and what we can derive from some of these best practices in the matter of standard setting. You also, I think, highlighted a couple of very key questions for us. Moving ahead, we are now in the whole business of standard setting, and we've had a conversation on this that we are really struggling in a sense that it's 2 steps forwards, 1 step back, because there are so many more complexities that go into behind a standard setting for different craft processes and materials. It's work in progress. We are mindful of the challenges that the study has thrown up, and we are reasonably confident that we would be able to present a set of standards that hold up to closer scrutiny for a couple of craft materials in the near future. So thank you, Meera. We are running a little short of time, so I will quickly move on to the next set of speakers in the session. It's lovely to have Mala and Pradeep ji with us. They have founded Bodhi, and their principle is rooted in sustainability and frugality. They've tried to stay unwaveringly on the path of true organic and environmentally friendly products that encourage both traditional weaving and printing techniques. Suffice to say that they have carved a niche for themselves and their label with a contemporary way to fashion conscious buyers. Apart from their stellar contributions through Bodhi, however, they have also provided an open learning space to many explorers who are seeking to tread this difficult path towards sustainability. And it is in keeping with this generosity of spirit that I invite them to share their journey with us today. So Malaji, Pradeep over to you.
All right, so I hope I'm audible now.
Yes, yes, perfectly, Pradeep ji.
Okay, so shall I share the presentation or will Karuna do it?
I think Karuna can. Yes.
Yeah, okay, okay. Okay, so this is Bodhi. We are located in Goradia in Gujarat, in an industrial estate, the Makarpura industrial estate. And therefore we sort of work in an industrial environment with all the legalities and laws that apply to a industrial situation. On this forum, we are going to basically show you how we have managed to become a zero waste company, where we use to start with very little water. For example, we use half the quantity of water that a typical traditional craftsman or industry would use. If you go to Kutch, and all of you have seen dyeing and printing units, you will find that the huge tanks of water that flow from one into the other. When we started our production in the industrial estate, we did not have access to piped water. It was available only for short periods of time. We had a borewell in those days that gave us a little bit of water at 70 feet. And we needed to use that water. So it started from need. We started trying to experiment with lesser and lesser quantities of water. We didn't make any tanks. We used these recycled plastic drums to do all our washing in. And it is just that if you observe why you're using what material and what are the consequences, in time you do get the ideas of saving at every stage. So this is how we saved water to start with. What you see in the floor is our chowkadi. It has been raining heavily the last 2 days. So all my spaces are full of water right now. The next slide. Yeah, this is my effluent treatment plant. So water from all over my workshop, wherever dyeing or printing is taking place and water is used, it all comes and collects in these tanks, where it is treated with lime and alum to control the pH and to flocculate the suspended particles. You see the new plumbing, because during the lockdown, my old pumps got jammed up and they were not worth repairing anymore. So we are in the process of installing new pumps there. So we pump the water from this tank and we put it into a settling tank. We allow it to settle, take out the sludge. And next slide, please. And this is my filtration system. This is where we actually clean the water. This canna plantation sits on top of a sand and pebble filter, and this is a three-stage filtration setup where the water becomes clean. It is clean for discharge in the general areas. You can put it into a lake or pond or for agriculture or for gardening. It achieves all the norms required by the Gujarat Pollution Control Board, which is actually quite a strict norm. But we don't throw this water out. We turn it around and we recycle it for all other purposes. Next slide. So another view of the Kena plantation. It is so lovely and blooming because it has been raining. It doesn't look like this in the summer. In the summer, it looks like what plants in summer look like. Next. This is another view of the treatment plant. You can see the settling tank with the pipe sticking out from the bottom. That is from where we remove the sludge, which is then taken away to a solid waste disposal site, and the water from the tank goes into the filtration system. Next. This is a series of tanks that we fill with rainwater. So this is a rainwater harvesting system. All these tanks are 3,000 liters each. So 3 4 are 12,000 liters. I can fill up in one night's rain. So the runoff from my terrace is collected in an underground tank, and we pump up the water, and these tanks are filled up. And I use this for some of my soft water needs. When I'm mixing dyes, in many cases I need very soft water. The water that I get from my borewell is rather hard. So this water is used for my dyeing and printing. Next. This little drain, surface drain that you see and that hole, that leads to another rainwater harvesting system. So initially I made this rainwater system in the early 80s, actually, when it was not very well known or well appreciated. In fact, my neighbor told me I was wasting my money doing all this. But this has been working for all these decades, and I do hope that whatever I draw out during the whole year, I return to the aquifer during the monsoons. Next. Right, on top of the terrace, what you see, this fiberglass box, that is a solar oven, and this we use for baking of pigment printed fabrics. You may know, some of you may know that pigment printed fabrics require to be baked at a particular temperature. Industrially, it is done in electric ovens, and the process takes 5 minutes to do. In my solar oven, it takes 3 days, but the quality that I get out of it is much better than Bombay dyeing. Next. This is something I just photographed yesterday. Mala has this habit of saving everything. She doesn't throw anything away. So I've got mountains and mountains of scrap fabric, cut-offs, waste, and pieces which we keep collecting through the years. And we have market once the markets open up.
I think we may have temporarily lost Malaji and Pradeepji. Let's give them a minute to reconnect. We are
Okay.
all grappling with technology. these days.
All right, so this is a very small part of the pieces of fabric that Mala has been collecting. We have been making products out of this, but after the lockdown, we have started with a small team to work again. And I'll just show you in brief a couple of things that we are making out of these scraps of fabric. Next one. Now we can go fast through this. It's not a marketing one, so just go fast through it. Karuna, आगे बढ़ते जाओ फटाफट.
Yeah.
Okay, done. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Is there time left, Shreya?
Yes, if Malaji would also want to say something, because I've heard her speak on frugality also beautifully in Bombay, and I would want to leave our audience with that thought.
Frugality is something that I think is inherent culturally in all of us. It's not just in design or in working, but we have I think almost in all cultures, we have a tradition of recycling food. Bacha hua khana, you turn into something, and so it was not a new concept for us to be frugal or to use just enough. This whole business of over designing or doing more than what it requires is something that I think the industrial production gave us. I remember Pradeep often gives this example that when television and all was new, when we were children, and there were lots of ads of toothpaste, and you would see the girl, they're really pressing the tube so hard that it, covers and it almost falls out of your toothbrush. And so we understood that, if you really wanted your teeth to be clean, you needed to have a lot of toothpaste. It was basically, I suppose, more like a market thing, the more you use, the better it is. So somehow all of us have this thing in our heads that the more you use, better the product it is. But we don't realize that it not only ruins the product, but it also ruins the environment. And we were fortunate that we had very little money when we graduated from NID. We were starting like really from scratch. And therefore, for us, it was a need that we try and do, or we stretch the rupee as much as possible. We try and make the most of the resources that we have.
This has also given us very rich dividends.
Yes.
I have a very, very high quality product that I want to sort of show to people from the point of view of fastness of color, brilliance of color, all the other technical and industrial aspects of it. And I do that with very, very little resources. In the consumption of dyes or any other auxiliaries or soap or whatever that goes into dyeing and printing, the initial frugality that we was forced onto us in a way to start with, that was a need, has now become a quality issue.
Yeah. No, I think this is a very important point that you're highlighting about frugality being a key value proposition while talking about sustainability. And it's important for all of us, organizations and networks who are working with traditional artisan communities on sustainable models of undertaking business, to really keep that in mind as a frame of reference, because I'm so inspired to see how you have completely organized your rainwater harvesting, conservation, and also the effluence treatment space. Because the organization who we are working with for the very same process now in Javaja tells us that all that we've done is systematized and organized the mechanics of what we saw in Bodhi. And it's good for us to remember, and it's good for us to remember that with humble beginnings, with limited resources, these kind of sustainable pilots and solutions are possible. And that we do not keep inducing external dependencies in artisan communities with very expensive solutions, technologies, etc., that are often also very alien to them. So I think it's a very, very timely reminder from both of you.
In fact,
Yes,
yeah,
Pradeep ji.
in fact, the question that was asked to us in New York about our water treatment system was, how is it that you have kept your treatment plant working for decades without
Yes,
any technical help or without any engineers?
without any
Because,
AMC.
yeah, and because
Yes.
most of these water treatment systems that are technology heavy, high technology dependent, don't work after some time. They just fall apart, or people just shut them down and bypass them to keep their work going. Whereas in our case, we have had to struggle for some time, but today it is almost effortless.
Yes,
It's like
it's a
maintaining a small
self-sustaining
garden.
model. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Let's hope that we
Also,
can.
also from the point of view of frugality, because I was on the shop floor all the time, and because of the values that were inculcated maybe at NIT while we were students, that these are all natural resources, and it's not just good to just chuck them away. You have to respect them. So the inherent respect was there. And because I was on the shop floor, I was not someone who sort of walked in and out. I was there from morning till evening. I knew how hard the artisans worked to make a product. And therefore, it was foolish to make something which was substandard when everybody was putting in so much effort. The weaver was making beautiful fabric, somebody was doing hand dyeing, painting, somebody was doing printing. And therefore, I think subconsciously I also started my design journey as a pattern maker. Design journey also took such that it was not something that you designed very frivolously and you liked it today and you threw it tomorrow. I mean, we've had people
Very
who
conscious, very mindful production.
mindful, something which has an inherent classic quality about its design. So it's been very nice to see women who would have bought our sari maybe say 20 years ago, still wears it and they're still proud to show it, saying,
Yes.
look, we still get complimented, or people using our cushion covers and bed covers in their home, and it has gone from one generation to another. And so, longevity is not something that I planned, but maybe even as a person, I don't throw my clothes with every season. I mean, maybe I am not made like that. So something that you use for a long time. If you're fed up of it, if the weather is not right, maybe you keep it away for a few months, but you bring it out again and you use it. So this buying and throwing is not something which happens with.
I think very, very relevant comments on longevity and also the afterlife of products and the impact that this has on the whole sustainability ethic. And I think this is a perfect opportunity for me to segue into our last speaker with a little anecdote. बाबूलाल जी, आप सफर पे हो और आप जयपुर से ब्यावर वापस जा रहे हो और आप बहुत धैर्य के साथ आप बैठे हुए हो ताकि हम आपको सुन पाए, इसलिए बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। लेकिन मैं आपकी परिचय देने से पहले थोड़ा एक छोटा सा एक जो कहानी मैंने आपसे ही सुना था जब पहली बार मैं जवाजा गई थी कि बाहर से एक खरीदार बहुत पुराने आपके पास वापस आए और आपका बैग, जवाजा का जो लेदर बैग है, उसका स्ट्रैप शायद या बकल टूट गई थी और वो लेके आपके पास पहुंचे वो और कहने लगे कि ये बकल टूटा, इसको तो हम आसानी से मरम्मत कर सकते हैं, लेकिन ये बैग जो है, जो चमड़ा का जो बैग है, ये तो करीब पिछले 10-15 साल से मेरे साथ है, साथ ही नहीं छूट रहा है इससे। So I can think of no better way to introduce the work and the philosophy of Artisans Alliance Javaja. And we are very, very fortunate to have with us Babulal ji. Babulal ji Artisans Alliance Javaja के secretary है और वहाँ पे लेदर और टेक्सटाइल दोनों का काम ही संभालते हैं जवाजा कैंपस में। आइका के साथ हमारा बहुत गहरा एक संपर्क रहा है जवाजा के साथ, क्योंकि NID की हाथ पकड़ते हुए हम जवाजा पहुंचे, लेकिन उसके बाद हम वापस ही नहीं आ पाए और कुछ ना कुछ इनके साथ हम करते ही रहे। इनका जो वर्क फिलॉसफी है, मटेरियल्स को जैसे ये ट्रीट करते हैं और प्रोडक्ट के पीछे जो एक रिस्पेक्ट है, इसको लेके इसका जो एक बहुत ही अलग तरह का सस्टेनेबिलिटी फिलॉसफी उभर के आया है, और जिसके वजह से शायद अभी भी कंज्यूमर्स के तरफ से बहुत लोग ऐसे हैं जो कि जवाजा के प्रोडक्ट्स के बरोबर लॉयलिस्ट है। मुझे पता है कि आयका में ही काफी लोग आपके जो बैग्स है वो लगातार यूज करते जा रहे हैं बहुत सालों से। तो बाबूलाल जी, आपका सफर कैसा रहा? बहुत दिनों का ये सफर है और काफी चुनौतीपूर्ण ये सफर रहा है आपके लिए। और जब हम सस्टेनेबिलिटी के बारे में बात करते हैं तब शायद ये याद रखना बहुत जरूरी पड़ता है हमारे सबके लिए कि जमीनी स्तर में आखिर जाके ये सस्टेनेबिलिटी कैसे दिखता है। तो आपसे थोड़ा सुनना चाहते हैं कि आपका ये अनुभव कैसे रहा।
नमस्कार।
नमस्कार।
हमारा जैसे एसोसिएशन है आर्टिजन अलायंस जवाजा लेदर, पिछले 45 सालों से लेदर हैंडीक्राफ्ट का सारा काम कर रहे हैं और इसमें अभी 35 फैमिली हमारे साथ जुड़ी हुई है, वो सारे काम कर रहे हैं। और एसोसिएशन को 75 में IIM के प्रोफेसर मताई साहब ने बनाया था और श्रीमान अशोक चटर्जी साहब, जो अभी उनका तो बहुत बड़ा सहयोग है, उनके सहयोग से हम आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। और जो लेदर का काम होता है वो सारा वेजिटेबल डाई है। जो एनिमल की नेचुरल मौत हो जाती है उसकी जो हाइड निकालते हैं, कुछ हरिजन लोग बोलते हैं, उसकी जो हाइड होती है वो हाइड हम ट्रेनिंग करते हैं। कुछ हमारा प्रेजेंटेशन बनाया हुआ है, तो अभी आप बताओ उसके अंदर में। जी, ये हमारे संस्था के सबसे पुराने मेंबर है हरलाल जी, जो 75 से काम कर रहे हैं, जो अभी तक काम कर रहे हैं। नेक्स्ट, ये वर्तमान में जो हमारे संस्था के प्रेसिडेंट है पूर्णमल जी, जो प्रोडक्ट तैयार कर रहे हैं सारा हाथ से काम करते हैं और इसमें किसी तरह का कोई मशीन का कोई काम नहीं है। नेक्स्ट, ये जो हम हाइड तैयार करते हैं, जो प्रोडक्ट के पहले जो हाइड तैयार होती है, जो ट्रेनिंग करके जो हाइड तैयार की हुई जो हाइड है, ये बफेलो की हाइड होती है। नेक्स्ट, ये लेदर का जो ट्रेनिंग है, जो ट्रेनिंग चल रहा है, लेदर हम कैसे तैयार करते हैं, जिसमें बम्बोल की छाल पानी डाल के इसको 4-5 दिन रखते हैं और एक तरफ इसमें जैसे वापस तैयार होने के बाद में मूंगफली का तेल लगा के इसको सुखाते हैं, वो प्रोसेस है। नेक्स्ट, ये बम्बूल की छाल है, जो नेचुरल रहता है। बम्बूल एक पेड़ होता है जिसमें उसका अंदर का जो लकड़ी होता है उससे फर्नीचर बनते हैं, तो ऊपर जो उसका छाल होता है वो जो इसमें लेदर में काम आता है। एक तरफ जैसे वो हाइड होती है, उसका गुताई करके जो बैग बनाते हैं वो बैग बनाया जा रहा है। नेक्स्ट, ये वो बैग बना रहे हैं और एक तरफ एक कारीगर जो लेदर का प्रोसेसिंग करे, उस पे जो नेचुरल चमक होती है, जो एक ग्लास होता है, कांच होता है, उस कांच से नेचुरल चमक निकाल के प्रोडक्ट तैयार कर रहे हैं। नेक्स्ट, ये हमारे जो प्रोडक्ट के अंदर जो हमारे औजार हैं, जिसमें कोई ऐसा टेक्निकल नहीं होता है, नॉर्मल से औजार होते हैं, वो औजार है, वो काम कर रहे हैं। और एक तरफ जैसे वो हमारे लेदर का थ्रेड तैयार करते हैं, थ्रेड तैयार करके उससे प्रोडक्ट की सिलाई करते हैं, वो है। नेक्स्ट, ये जो प्रोडक्ट बिल्कुल तैयार हो गया, तैयार होने के बाद में इसकी जांच करके इसकी थोड़ी बहुत जो फिनिशिंग होती है, पैकिंग से पहले फिनिशिंग तैयार करके फिनिशिंग करते हैं। नेक्स्ट, जैसे वो लास्ट का हो गया, फिनिशिंग करने के बाद में सारा माल पैकिंग कर दिया जाता है और पार्टियों को भेज देते हैं। धन्यवाद।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया बाबूलाल जी, आप बहुत सुंदर तरीके से समझाए। आपका जो काम करने का जो विचार है और जो फिलॉसफी भी है वो बहुत अच्छे से उभर के आया है। We are running out of time, but I would want to address a couple of questions to the speakers we have with us today, because they are all extremely difficult to pin down. So now that we have a captive audience, I'm going to try and make use of their time for a few minutes more. There are a couple of questions that have already been answered in the question and answer box, but I think there are a couple that I would want the panelists to take up. One is a question that has been posed by Ghatit Bhai from Khamir. When we talk with artisans about local markets, they feel that we are taking them back to the same socio-economic order, which was also socially exploitative. They feel local markets will take them backward. How do we change this perception? Anybody would want to address this question from the speaker panel?
Can I?
Yes, Mr. Chatterjee. Mr. Kothari, please, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer. I just put in a small response in the chat, but I think the this is the reason why it's important to talk about more multiple levels of transformation or more holistic transformation. So the links between a craft and the caste or the community, and therefore also a kind of a social hierarchy that has existed traditionally, or new hierarchies that are coming up, those links need to be broken. I think there's two things here which are important, and neither of these is possible in the short run. So in the short run, the fact that markets are being sought outside, you get respectability through all of that is very understandable. But in the long run, one, the eradication of aspects like casteism or gender inequalities and all is part of the struggle. And we have seen in different parts of the world where this has happened. Even in India, examples where there is a much greater respectability that is given to the occupations that you have without associating them with the caste in a traditional sense. But secondly, and I think this is very important, it hasn't happened yet in Kutch as far as I remember, as far as I know, is that people from outside the traditional caste also take up the same occupation or the same craft. For instance, many young people from different communities are going into farming. Can young people go into into Kutch from other sections of the community and say we want to do handloom weaving? Would the handloom weavers themselves be open to teaching people from outside the Vankar community, for instance? These are questions that have to be asked, because if that happens, as is happening in some other occupations, then you begin to see the breakdown of this link between traditional inequalities, social inequalities, and craft. One. Secondly, very, very crucial to revive the local economy in such a way that, in fact, there is local buying power. Right now, you don't have the local buying power either for organic food or for much of the kind of crafts that are being talked about now, the crafts that have revived. And so how does one actually create a vibrant local economy? That requires much larger macro transformations in the economic and political sectors, which I briefly alluded to. So none of these things are going to happen unless we also tackle fundamentally the kinds of unsustainable and inequitable structures we have, whether it's patriarchy or capitalism or any of the other structures of inequality. And there I also wanted to very quickly allude to something that Meera said, where I might have a slight difference of opinion. I don't think going the clean development mechanism and carbon trading or carbon credits route is a very healthy way to go, because these are both ways by which the currently extremely unequal and unsustainable economy is trying to sustain itself. we will keep polluting, you folks do the right thing and we'll give you carbon credits, or we'll think of you as clean development mechanism. By the way, clean development mechanism has been,
I agree with you on that.
Mark has been
Ashish,
also, I know,
saying we
Meera.
should
So I
go
was just
there.
getting to,
I'm saying these are two routes.
Absolutely. So what you said, secondly, and I totally agree with that, where you yourself also highlighted the flexible, benchmarking kind of thing. I think that's really, because that also means, and this is where something like the PGS system, which craftspersons themselves, along with all of you, can run,
Absolutely,
would be a much better way to go. So I was actually going to also support or agree with you on that point. And we have to then therefore look at aspects like degrowth, where there's been significant levels of high material and energy consumption all across the global north, including people like some of us on this call, and approaches of well-being, which emanate from our own, approaches like Swaraj and so many others, which come from our own civilization. So, thanks.
I'd just like to share one thing. Share just one point. I'm just adding one point to what Ashish said.
Sure.
I just want to share one thing. In the course of the study, we met a couple of scientists who were working on climate change. And one of the things they said was that if overall, globally, you just reduce production and consumption by 30%, that's going to solve the problem. That's all it's going to take. Sorry.
That was a good submission. Mr. Chatterjee, you had raised your...
Just to say that on this local production, all the factors that have been talked about just now are valid, but so also is the importance of understanding the market and understanding that artisans over the coming years should be able to drive the market, not just be driven by it.
Subservient.
And one of that is to see the opportunities that exist locally. For example, some years ago, the artists of Javaja were encouraged by local well-wishers that, have you looked at the tourism trade? And have you looked at the fact that they're right next door to one of the biggest pilgrimage centers in the country, which is Ajmer? And are there inexpensive products that you can make for pilgrims that you might want to diversify into? So the need also is that segmenting your markets is a very intrinsic part of marketing management, and marketing management is indispensable to sustainable livelihoods. There's no way of getting out of it, and we better begin to respect the market and not be necessarily driven by it, but we have some control over it. So I'm all for the artisans taking every advantage they can, such as carbon credits, but only after understanding what's going on and hopefully being able to dictate the terms on which these systems work in a way which they've not been able to do. There are plenty of examples of local craft production flourishing. The Gamcha in West Bengal is one of the best examples.
Shreya, you're on mute.
Yeah, you are on mute.
Yeah, so we've really just wanted to say that we've dismally run out of time, but that also goes to show that this is an unending conversation. This is the beginning of the series of webinars on sustainability that we are initiating, and I hope that we progress further on these lines in this year with these discussions. I'd like to thank all the panelists for sparing their time and energy to come and contribute to this discussion. And I would like to end with a thought from Ela Bhatt in Anubandh, where she speaks eloquently about how reducing the distance between producer and consumer, producer and the raw materials will restore the economic and political balance in the world. The answer is in the local, the indigenous. And India's traditional handicrafts and handloom sectors naturally have the attributes of a green economy with their USPs of being local, indigenous, culturally rooted, low energy driven, and socio-economically enabling for communities who have held these knowledge systems for centuries. Thank you for joining us for the first series on sustainability. There is a long way to travel, but we remain excited about all the solidarities and possibilities that lie in the road ahead. Thank you.
I'd just
Thank
like to
you.
apologize. I think I took up other people's time. So please, my apologies.
No,
Really,
Meera,
very
it's
sorry.
completely all right. I think we had a very well-rounded discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Shreya.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Shreya.